to the Indian Diaspora podcast, where we spotlight extraordinary minds of Indian origin. We have a phenomenal guest today, someone who's done extensive work on global climate governance. She recently won the Spinoza Prize in 2023 and has been pivotal in writing the intergovernmental reports on climate change. She's been on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the report from 2007 won the Nobel Peace Prize. So she's been doing a lot of important work in the nexus of climate, governance, global north, global south, and equity, to put it in her language. But I'm not going to say too much because her resume runs for books if not pages. So I'm going to give the floor to Joyeeta to take it forward. Very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this broadcast, and I would just like to perhaps add that the IPCC prize was for the entire genre of IPCC publications till 2007, and so we were amongst the entire family of authors who worked on IPCC.
Amazing. Nice. But as the lead author, until today, she's doing a great job with that. So before we go into anything in depth, I want to ask you a little bit about how your upbringing was. How was your childhood?
So my father worked in the Indian Air Force, and as a consequence, we moved from place to place. And I was born in Delhi, but then we moved to Bangalore and Allahabad and back to Delhi, and then he moved on to Bangalore, but I stayed on in Delhi. So that basically meant it was a very mobile childhood. As a consequence, most of the time I went to convent schools because they all had English as a medium of education. Mm-hmm. And so when you move from place to place, the convents also gave preference to Air Force children. Mm-hmm. And that meant I was mostly in those convents, except at the end when I started studying at the Air Force Central School in Delhi. Mm-hmm. And that was an unbelievably unique experience because that school had just so many extracurricular activities, debating, dancing, theatre, and it was a co-educational school and with so much resources that we used to have big theatrical performances and music performances, fashion shows, sports. It was unbelievable. And at the end of the process, I also ended up being school captain of that school. I was the second female school captain in the history of the school. And so that was quite exciting. And then I went on to Lady Shri Ram College for Women in Delhi to study economics honors. And subsequently, I went to Ahmedabad to study law. It had to do also with the fact that my father had a heart attack and there was some financial stresses at home. So I went to stay with an uncle in Ahmedabad who hosted me for 3 years, and I studied law there. And partly because of the financial crisis, because to go back in the history of my family, my father had spent a lot of his money for the education and healthcare of his parents and siblings in Tripura and later in Calcutta. Mm-hmm. So that was why there was a bit of stress. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I started to write for newspapers. So for Indian Express, and then I started first with University News in Delhi, and then in Ahmedabad, I started working on old architectural buildings and writing up little stories about all the different architectural buildings. And then I got a column on consumer issues, and then that column was every Saturday morning. And at the end of 3 years, I had some 200 articles, and that may have helped me get the INLACs subsequently, because in the INLACs scholarship process, you have to not only write a letter, but you go, I was lucky enough to be invited to the interview, but in the interview, I already had so many publications that I think it helped in getting the full scholarship for Harvard. So it is like from a little bit of bad luck, good luck came out of it. Mm-hmm. And in the meanwhile, while I was in the consumer organization in Ahmedabad, the Bhopal accident took place, the Union Carbide accident took place, and our NGO was very seriously involved in inviting amicus curiae lawyers from the United States to help prepare a case on this particular issue. And I got very, very involved in that whole process. And then one of the lawyers who came, we were having a conversation, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to go to Harvard Law School." And he laughed and he said, "Well, if you ever get admission, write to me and I will help you get an internship with Ralph Nader." And Ralph Nader was the head of the consumer movement, if you like, was the guru of the consumer movement. And since I was working part-time with the Consumer Education Research Center in Ahmedabad, I thought, why not? That would be great.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I got those scholarships. So I wrote straight to him and I said, "Hey, I'm coming. Can you give me an internship with Ralph Nader?" I don't think he ever thought that this would work out. But he phoned Nader, and Nader then said, "Okay, she can come." And Nader's office never pays very well, but it was a very exciting experience working with the consumer center in Nader's office and with his staff. So I did 2 months of that before I went to law school, and after I came back and I did another 6-7 months over there, and then I was on my going back home. I had a one-way ticket to India, and in the meanwhile I had got an internship in the Netherlands. So I said, okay, it's an open ticket, so I'll stop in Netherlands for 1 year and then go back home. And then I fell in love with the Dutch man, and that's why I stayed here. And that was a bit of a panic moment for me, because I was educated in economics and Indian law and then international law, but I knew nothing about Dutch law and I didn't speak the Dutch language. So you had to reinvent yourself to fit into the society, and I never thought it would work out. But my very first job application was weird, because there was an advertisement in English. Most advertisements in Dutch newspapers are in Dutch, right? There was an advertisement in English for an ecologist. And I applied saying, "I'm not an ecologist, I'm a legal scholar, do you need me?" And they wrote back saying, "We don't need you, but we don't mind meeting you." And then the next morning they had phoned the Ministry of Environment, and I was hired as a consultant to help the Ministry of Environment write their climate speeches and climate policies in English. And from then on it just took off, and 3 years later, and there was a deal I had made with my mentor in the Netherlands, Professor Pierre Wellinka, and the deal was that he said to me, "If you work at the ministry, you can say whatever you like inside our meetings, but when you represent us, you have to say what we have decided collectively. So you have to suppress your own thoughts, you have to do what the group has decided." And then one day he phoned me after 3 years and said, "I've got a job for you." He had left in the meanwhile to become the director of the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije University, and he phoned me and he said, "I've got a job where you can think and speak for yourself."
Wow.
So then I went and joined the university, and I did my PhD there, and then I moved on to become Professor of Climate. And I stayed on at the Free University from 93 till 2012. And then I had another piece of good luck, I think it was. The consultancy that hired me to work at the ministry was based in Delft. And in Delft, the Institute for Water Education was looking for a replacement for Dante Caponera, who was a lawyer, a water lawyer, from the Food and Agricultural Organization, who would fly in every year to teach. But he was getting on in his years, and they wanted somebody local. And then I was the lawyer, environmental lawyer, and so the consultancy told IHE Delft that maybe I could do that job. And so what basically happened was the consultancy gave me about 3 weeks to read up everything on water law and then go for an interview with this Mr. Dante Caponera. And of course I couldn't answer any of his questions, but nevertheless the next morning he told the institution I could take over. And that meant that since 1990 I have also worked and researched and taught water law and governance. And so then I was looking at local water law, transboundary water law, national, and of course global water law. So those were the areas. And of course climate change and water are very close, but in the early days they were completely separate issues. In fact, even today many water issues don't enter the climate negotiations, and climate issues did not interfere with the Water Courses Convention. So suddenly I found I was in the two really hot topics. And so then I became also professor in Delft on water. And since 2013, I'm here at the UvA as Professor of Environment and Development. And 2 years ago, I became a distinguished professor on climate justice, sustainability, and global constitutionalism.
What an exciting start. There's so many things on the way,
right.
And that's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. I can imagine how many things you would have picked up from all these different people and different organizations.
And different views, and yes.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. Thank you. You told us a little bit about your upbringing and then how you got to where you are today. Was there, you've moved continents a couple of times already, and how was it culturally for you? How has that impacted you before you met your partner maybe?
So perhaps in this entire story, what I forgot to tell was the role of my mother in all of this. Mm-hmm. My mother has been a school teacher, and she was very, very influential, and she's the one who kept saying my daughter should become a lawyer and go to Harvard, and that was also one of the reasons why it was sort of in the back of my mind, because it was not my father would have preferred perhaps if I had gone into a different discipline. Mm-hmm. But he was very supportive that I did what I did, but still it was mostly my mother that was pushing me, and she was really focusing on public speaking. Mm-hmm. So right from my combination of my school there for Central School, which encouraged public speaking, and my mother that was training me all the time for public speaking, those helped hell of a lot in life after. And I suppose what's really key is that, of course, my mother is a Brahmo, so a member of the Brahma Samaj, mm-hmm. which is sort of a reform movement in Hinduism from Raja Ram Mohan Roy onwards. My father was perhaps a more conservative, had a more conservative upbringing, but he changed a lot over the years with us because he had 2 daughters, and he did everything he could to give us the freedom we needed to become the people we were. Mm-hmm. So at home it was a very, very open upbringing. Mm-hmm. My mother's family was much better educated than my father's family, and they were always doing quite well in life. So when we were growing up, there was just a lot of English literature books in the house. Mm-hmm. So you were very familiar with the systems and cultures in English-speaking countries. Okay. So but I remember that the first day I arrived at Boston, and when I came to Washington, I kept thinking I entered into a hospital because it looked so sanitized. It looked so clean. Buses looked clean, it was so different from in India. Mm-hmm. So that was very interesting. A little other story is, I remember that in Harvard, I was in the hostel. On the Tuesdays, people used to watch one television program, and the Wednesdays, people watched a different one in the common room. And I went to both, and both groups accepted me. Mm. And it took me some time to realize that one group was a completely white group, and the other group was all colored. Mm. I didn't realize I was colored, so I joined the white group, thinking, okay, I'm just a human being, they're human beings. And they accepted me. Mm. But for the colored group, I was also seen as a traitor because I was sitting in the other group. And I didn't realize at that point how much color played a role in that university at that time. Mm-hmm. And that made me also more conscious, because after about 3-4 months, when I realized what the situation was, I became more conscious of who I am and where I belong, and I was afraid to talk freely with people. That was a very strange moment. The other thing was, and this is a completely different kind of story, is that AIDS was very, very common in those days. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was that the boys in the university sort of had divided in their head that the white women and maybe some Southeast Asian women are more, and South American women are more free. Mm-hmm. But South Asians are conservative, so they would be AIDS free. Oh. So suddenly you found yourself extremely popular and you couldn't figure out why you were so popular that people wanted to dance with you or whatever it was, have coffee with you. And later on, we had some meetings organized by the university campus because of the AIDS problem. And then I realized that it was not because we were so attractive, it was simply because their guess was that we were AIDS-free. Anyway, that was just a small little thing. But when I came to the Netherlands, I think the first culture shock was that prior to 5th of December, there was, of course, Sinterklaas. And all these people dressed in black. And I was quite confused about what's happening. And it was not Santa Claus, it was something completely different. And I didn't really explore this topic very much. And when it blew up in Dutch politics a few years ago, I stayed out of it because it became too polarizing in many of the discussion processes. And even though there's a painting in the Rijksmuseum which shows Sinterklaas long before people were painted black. So it's not that old a tradition. But apart from that, if I look at my in-laws' family, it's slightly different from the Indian family. Indians are much more maybe hospitable and they're cooking and everything is. But my family over here is also extremely nice. And so that was not really an issue. I don't think in the Netherlands I was very lucky because I just ended up in good jobs all the way through, and I have a fantastic partner and child, and so sort of more or less settled in. I don't think, and I'm a non-practicing Hindu anyway, and I don't think I'm religious. I do think that there's some degree of spirituality, but so that has never been never been a problem.
Okay. Clear.
Oh, but in the pre-university, before I got a permanent job, in those days, you had to be a Christian or you had to explain what your feelings were or beliefs. And so I remember my professor, he gave me a lecture of an hour on what Christianity is. And then he had to write a report in which he said, I went to convents for most of my life. I was married to a Protestant, and therefore I should have more or less similar values. But I tested him, I asked him, what would you do differently as a scientist than somebody from India? Anyway, we did. It was
something to really think about. Talking about beliefs, myths.
Yeah.
Nice. Back to a little bit of science again. You're in environmental justice.
Yes.
And I think you've spent your life, if I can put it that way, trying to bring environmental justice, especially global north, south, all of this. How did you come into this nexus of all of these things? It's just
It started with the Bhopal crisis, because in the Bhopal crisis, what we noticed was that multinationals found it easy to avoid laws in developing countries. And therefore they could lower their standards in the developing world. So that was my first story, that I now must focus on the role of these large multinational companies. So that was the first moment. And I, as a child, I had asthma in India, so I used to get all these medicines. And when I was going to law school in the US, my doctor said, you can't take these medicines to the US because they are not allowed in the US. And I was a bit angry with him, and I said, what do you mean you're giving me medicines I'm not allowed to take? And somehow that became actually the topic of my thesis in law school, because I focused on the fact that drug companies were selling drugs in the global south that were withdrawn in global north countries. So what they do is they wait. The moment they think that the government is going to ban the drug, they withdraw it. So then the banning is not needed. But then they have all these supplies that they provide them to the developing world. And then you get exposed to those drugs. So in my MSc thesis in law school, I focused on the fact that why are drugs being sold to developing countries when they are not allowed for sale in rich countries? And that I wanted to turn the burden of proof, which meant that before a multinational could sell a drug in a developing country, they had to prove that the situation in India or China or Ghana or whatever it is so radically different from the situation, the health situation in the UK and the US or whatever, that it would be justified to do so. But it was just changing the burden of proof, because now the situation before that was the company could just sell the drugs and NGOs would then have to fight and say this drug shouldn't be on the market. But the NGOs can't get the data because they don't have the information, and NGOs are poor. So I just turned the burden of proof that if the NGO takes you to court, it is the responsibility of the company to prove it's important, not. Now, this thesis was very provocative because the professor who was supposed to be my supervisor, he encouraged me through the entire process, and the night before he sent me a letter saying, you're using developing countries, you're using rich countries as guinea pigs with retrospective effect. And I couldn't figure out what that was, so I went to another lawyer because we were all lawyers over there, and that guy told me, this means he's going to give you an F tomorrow. And anyway, it caused a lot of problems. I finally phoned Nader's office and I finally got a new supervisor, and eventually I did get an A+ for the thesis. But you can imagine that this particular problem was so critical for many of these lawyers because they work for the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
And they don't want something like this to come out. So those were two really big moments when I began to worry about the role of multinationals. And then I came to the Netherlands, and my very first job in the NGO was to look at the toxic transboundary movement of hazardous waste. So when there's a lot of hazardous waste over here, you just put it to a ship and you go to a unsuspecting fisherman somewhere in Africa and you say, I'll give you £100 per year if you keep this drum on your land. And the drum is full of chemicals. And there were also ships that were moving around the world with toxic waste. And the Indian Coast Guard came out once because of all the NGOs that came out with this information to prevent the ship from docking in India. And so it was a terrifically frightening period about this hazardous waste going to developing countries. And so then the Basel Convention was negotiated, and I was representing an NGO over there. So that was also a north-south issue. And then, of course, climate change came up because I was going to work for the Ministry of Environment in the Netherlands. And I remember that the very first conference I went to, each country came up with their speeches. And if you analyze the speeches of the countries, there were 66 countries present, you could see a very big difference between what rich countries are saying and what poorer countries are saying. And I was the one who was editing all the speeches and putting them into a book, because I was doing more or less English language work, editing. And when I was looking at all that, I thought, hey, there is a huge fight between rich and poor countries, because rich countries are emitting so many greenhouse gas emissions. And poor countries in 1990, they were so poor, they were hardly emitting. But they would be at the end of the emissions. So for that reason, and that's how I got into this whole North-South, role of multinationals, role of justice, in these issues. But I remember my supervisor telling me, don't focus on justice in your thesis explicitly because it's maybe a bit normative and people may not like it, so make it empirical. So the whole thesis was about north-south issues, like, empirical things, but I avoided using too many words like justice and equity. I would just bring the arguments up, but it was all about justice. Today it's easier to talk about justice. Justice has become liberated as a scientific term.
Nice to know it, at least moving in the right direction, if we are.
Yeah.
You brought it nicely towards justice with the whole story, I think. Now, if we can step down a little bit and probably, sustainability, just like justice, sustainability has become, in my opinion at least, has become a fancy term popping up everywhere, and people just want to put it in, if you probably put it on paper, it could get accepted faster, or it's like cancer or something like that could give you more money. Or something. But to start with, can you explain sustainability to probably the common man?
Okay, so basically sustainability has, if you like, two components. The first component is that you're trying to find the happy medium between social, economic and ecological. So you want to do something that is both economically good, socially good, and ecologically good. And you want to be at the center point. The second part of the sustainability narrative is that we should not use so much of the earth that there is nothing left for future generations to use. So that's an intergenerational component, and the first one is perhaps an intra-generational component with a small bit of interspecies component, which is the environmental part. My big problem with sustainability, I do use it in my title, but my big problem with sustainability is that when you say, let's take climate change, if you look at the fossil fuel empire, it is worth between $16 trillion and $295 trillion. So we're really talking about something that is either 1/5 of global GDP or it is 3 times the size of global GDP. That's how much it is. And I'm talking about not just the oil producers, but also like the airplanes that use oil, the ships that use oil, the cars that use oil, houses that have embodied CO2, etc. So that empire is very, very expensive. Now to compete with that, scholars have said, okay, the environment, and I'm going back to 2007 because that was when the data is from, it's also worth $125 trillion. Okay, so he said it's $125 trillion, and maybe if I look at the cost of inaction on human lives and health, I would come up with a number too. But these two numbers are fictitious numbers because you don't actually pay that money. So what basically happens is that when you try to come to the middle of this triangle, you are inevitably pushed towards the economic values. And these two values disappear from the agenda because that is what the most important value is. And then if you look at the way companies behave, shareholders only care about the economic returns on investment. Of course, there's reputational damage in the social and ecological, but the bottom line is how much do I get back on my shares? And the CEO is also valued primarily on that. So what they try to do is to optimize this income at the top, and then a bit of greenwashing on the right side for the environmental issues, and a bit of social washing on the other side. Oh, see how good we are for people. And by doing that, the entire sustainability story has got completely biased towards economic development. And this is not just with respect to, let's say, fossil fuel, but if you look at AI companies right now, they claim that they will solve environmental issues and social issues. That's what their claim is. Or we don't worry, we'll help the farmers figure out when to put the seed into the ground. But the AI, if it is used, produced using first fossil fuel energy and water, and a lot of resources are needed for this. As well, of course, it takes all our knowledge. I'll come back to that. It takes our knowledge for free and we get nothing back as authors. And then the results are sold to all of us. So what happens is that when the AI companies are worth so much that right now they dominate universities, they dominate the UN system because they say we can solve these problems. But actually they can only tell the farmer, you should do the seed now or tomorrow. But if you do the seed now and there's an extreme weather event tomorrow, the plant doesn't come anyway. So AI can't predict all the extreme weather events, etc. Even if it can, maybe it would conclude, don't farm at all. And that doesn't help the farmer whatsoever. So of course AI is good in some ways, but it is better when the information it gets is of good quality, which is most likely from global north countries and less from global south. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make over here is that in this triangle, almost all the topics I take, whether it is water or climate or biodiversity loss, I find that the environmental issues are completely marginalized, even though we talk about the cost of inaction, while the profit-making sector just continues to make profit. And then when you look at current versus future generations, then again you see that majority of current generations are very poor, and their future generations will be poorer because of the fact that there's PFAS in the soil everywhere, there's air pollution all over Delhi or whatever. There's pollution everywhere in the world, and our children will grow up in a world of pollution. But if you look at the super rich, the money, they are getting richer and richer and richer, and then they will. So there's a whole problem in the way in which the intergenerationality is being interpreted. So while I still think sustainability is a good concept, that we have to fight to make sure that the monetary denominator is not so dominant, which is why in most of my work I focus on inclusive development. And inclusive development looks at economic, social, and political. And with this lens, we look at the economic system, because these three are all qualitative elements, and they give you a more balanced view about how to look at the economy and to see where do you want economic growth to happen and where would you like to close down economic fields because of the massive impact on the environment. So to continue to finish up this little storyline, my story is no longer that we should integrate or find the medium point. My story is the environment should be the outer circle, and the economy should not be allowed to do anything that either crosses the safe and just earth system boundaries or quality standards.
Right.
So if you cannot give me food without using pesticides, don't give me the food.
Clear.
And also because 1/3 of food is being wasted worldwide, and meat consumption has a huge pressure. So if you eat more vegetarian, I'm not saying completely stop eating meat, but if you eat more vegetarian, you have a smaller footprint on the earth.
Yeah.
So there are ways in which we can do, and if you cannot give me AI that is greenhouse gas free and has a small footprint, don't give me AI, is my view. Because I don't think that we should mess up our climate so much. Already we are on our path to 2.7. Given current politics, we probably will be on a higher path, and if you take into account that 78% of the remaining fossil fuel is the developing world, it might be still higher. So we are going into a world of complete unpredictability and enormous harm to people worldwide. So my feeling is at this moment we should actually do some kind of a injunctive relief. You can do a technology, but only if your environment impact assessment is properly done. Only if CO2 is taken as a pollutant and not ignored, because nowadays CO2 is not always seen as a pollutant. It is seen as a pollutant right now by the law of the sea. The tribunal has said that the CO2 is a pollutant because CO2 is causing ocean acidification. And maybe other reasons also, maybe coral bleaching, and that affects the fisheries. So the law of the sea has said it, but the UNFCCC has not really said CO2 is a pollutant, and therefore environment impact assessments should always account for this.
Why is climate justice also connected or inseparably connected to social and in some ways economic justice as well?
Okay, so for me, climate justice has 6 elements. The first element is the fact that even though we knew in 1990 that up to 1 degree it is green, between 1 and 2 it is orange, which means some parts of the world will suffer a lot, and beyond 2 it is red, which means the whole world will suffer. Even though we knew that, and there was enough evidence for a long time, countries waited for 25 years before they were willing to adopt a 2-degree target. Under pressure from the small island states, they also added perhaps as low as 1.5. In the research that we have done, we have argued that 1.5 is not a just target, it may be a safe target, in the sense that after 1.5 we trigger all kinds of irreversible impacts. But already at 1 degree centigrade, tens of millions of people worldwide are suffering from high heat and high humidity, which means they can die within a course of a day, as well as extreme weather events like floods, droughts, fires, and of course saltwater intrusion and all kinds of other impacts. So for us, 1 degree centigrade is a just target. We're already almost at 1.5. The trend has not been established, but we have crossed 1.5 for 1 or 2 years. So that 25-year delay allowed rich countries to continue to use fossil fuel in their own territories, but also to continue to export fossil fuel knowledge to developing countries and to finance that through export credit. So basically they're creating a lock-in in the developing countries while they themselves are trying to maximize and optimize the use of fossil fuel. That's the first problem. It's an injustice towards the global south.
Right.
The second injustice is that because we could have known in 1990, if we had a long-term target, what the carbon budget or carbon cake is like. And then we could have divided it amongst countries in one way or the other. It could have been done fairly. But we didn't do that. We had a principle, but we didn't allocate. We waited for 25 years. Now the cake has become so small that you can't allocate it. And so what they then said was, oh, every country should do what it likes. So if you now add up what every country is willing to do, we are at 2.7 degrees centigrade. But if you take into account that many countries say they're willing to do something and the next government changes things, like in the Netherlands or in the United States, then you find that it will be much more than 2.7. Okay?
Yeah.
So, and this is going to create the injustices of the impacts, etc. Moreover, if I go to the third injustice, and that is that we assumed that there's a cake and that if we eat up most of the cake, there's very little for the global south. We didn't account for the fact that 78% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the developing world. It's in their territory. And in 2015, developing countries and also rich countries said in the UN Sustainable Development Goal document that we have full permanent sovereignty over natural resources. So they basically push the narrative that they can do what they like with their oil. And what I understand from a lot of scholarship as well as from diplomats that I train sometimes is that developing countries would like to use their fair share. Now, we didn't leave a fair share for them. So if they use their fair share, we will go way beyond the 2.7 degrees centigrade. And this means that because we did not leave the fair share for them, and because we also locked them into a fossil fuel future through our own investments in the global south, our use of export credit to finance fossil fuel in the developing world, our shareholding of their fossil fuel, because we did that, we have created all these people who are employed by the fossil fuel sector and who will now run the risk of losing their jobs, whether it's in the mines or the factories. I'm not talking about CEOs. CEOs have a different category. And so basically now there's a whole labor problem that is there, because if you close it down, all these guys lose their jobs. And mining is, place relevant. You can't just move miner from here to there. It's not so easy. So this creates a massive employment, a labor justice issue in the developing world. Okay. Then if you take another component of the same idea is, and I have a map that shows that, prepared by my colleague Yang, is that if you look at the coal mines worldwide, most coal mines in the rich countries are white in color, implying that they have about 5 to 10 years life left. Most coal mines in South Asia and Southeast Asia are dark red in color, implying they have another 50, 60, 70 years. So if you close them down overnight, that's a massive loss of income. And especially when those mines have been created with borrowed money, because then your investment plan is taken into account that you'll pay over the next 30 years. And then if you close it down after 10 years, you're 20 years down. This is called stranded assets. And so for the developing world, there's a major risk of stranded assets, which we encourage because we continue for 25 years to use fossil fuel, so they thought it's not serious, so they also use fossil fuel, right? We didn't set the right example in the global north. And moreover, as I said to you earlier, the fossil fuel industry is worth $60 to $295 trillion, so closing it down will mean enormous stranded assets in terms of money, infrastructure, people, so on and so forth. It's a huge headache, and if we had started in 1990 and planned this through, it could have been gently done. Injustice number 4, that is market mechanisms. So early on in the 1990s, when we were talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, everybody said, oh, it's so expensive, let's do it cheap. You could do it cheap in developing countries or East Europe through joint implementation, the clean development mechanism, emissions trading, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and now net zero. So you have all these mechanisms by which you can compensate somewhere in the world. And I remember a time when the Dutch government just signed a check to Latvia to get their emission reductions, which were happening anyway after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So basically what we did was we wrote these easy checks and we bought emission reductions all over the world. And what we did not do was to educate our public and to tell them that your next house, if you have a house, should be fossil free. If you're renting out your house in 10 years, try to make it fossil free. If you're building new houses, try to go for less embodied CO2 emissions. That educational process that was necessary in the global north, also required by the Climate Change Convention under one of its articles, was not done because it was so easy to reduce emissions abroad. And this is sort of a carbon colonialism narrative in terms of we live our lives as we want it, and then we just give a little check for you to reduce your emissions, and we take that reduction to our side of the balance sheet. That's the fourth injustice. Then I come to the fifth injustice. The fifth injustice is already from 0 degrees, the impacts of climate change have been happening. At every 1 degree rise in temperature means a 7% increase in water vapor in the atmosphere, which means the clouds become so heavy that the rains fall down in one go. Part of the problem that we are talking about extreme weather events, and this is happening not just in Pakistan, which had 1/3 flooding, but it's happening all over the world. And you can see now in the United States, in Europe, forest fires, flooding, massive rainfall. It's happening everywhere, and now also the drinking water supply in the Netherlands is being affected by a combination of reasons, including climate change. So the impacts are supposed to be at least $15 million per hour worldwide. That is the conservative estimate, because I presented that at a conference in a few months ago, and at that conference a European Union officer told me that it was much higher, because in the last 4 or 5 years the damage in Europe is unbelievably high. So basically the lifestyles of the super rich are causing massive damage, and it may be that you and I can escape because we have a good job and we have an income and we can maybe move back to India or whatever, we can escape. But a lot of people cannot escape. They're stuck in a certain place. They don't have that many revenues. They can't escape that impact. So the farmers can't escape the impact. Water producers, water generators, water is used everywhere. If the entire hydrological system is collapsing as a consequence of melting glaciers, rising sea level rise, salt water intrusion into the groundwater, and change in evaporation, the cycles, if that is all changing, then the weather as we know it becomes so unpredictable that the damage will become more and more and more. So the loss and damage that people will face will increase. And insurance is not there even for rich people. The insurance companies are moving out of Florida. In Los Angeles, many of them didn't want to pay. I remember in Boston when Sandy happened, there was a problem with the insurance companies. So insurance companies are also trying to avoid doing climate damage, especially in regions where problem. That was the sixth impact. Who's going to pay for the damage? Will it be the poorest, or will it be also the people who caused the biggest harm? And in my view, it has to be the oil companies, because they are the ones who made the most money out of the system. And they knew from 1950. So there's a lot of evidence about how they knew it, how they manipulated the narrative. They went first to denial, then they went to delay. And denial consisted of this is not happening, casting doubt on the science, lobbying heavily with governments, and revolving door, which is that you see the officials go into the government, or government officials join the oil companies. A lot of that, and then now they've gone into to delay, which is necessitarianism. You need me, I'm necessary for you. Or they say strategic blame displacement. It's not my fault, you wanted to drive a car, it's your fault. Third one is greenwashing, which is, oh, don't worry, we're doing a bit of renewables. Most of these companies are giving less than 1% of their total expenditure on renewables. And then the last one is, there's one more. Anyway, to cut a long story short, basically, I come now to the last of the injustices. If you look at the way our world is surviving right now, we extract resources and we pollute. And the implications of that, whether it is about energy, because energy cannot be made circular. Energy can be made renewable, but renewable energy needs unbelievable amounts of minerals, metals, copper, etc. You need grids, etc. You need unbelievable amounts of all that. So it's not as if energy can ever be made circular. It dissipates, and it's a law of energy. Then if you look at the metals and minerals that we use for all our telephones and everything else, most of it can't be recycled properly. So there is a limitation. And of course then there is food, which is not really a circular system right now. To cut a long story short, the way we are living right now, where we produce without care for the environmental and social impacts, since 1990 has been caused by deregulation. So there's been a huge movement, give business space to function, don't regulate them, don't force them to do all these permits, don't do the permits strictly, allow these companies to use all these various elements, including CO2, but also PFAS, antibiotics in the animals, which is now in the water system, plastics, all kinds of single-use plastics have turned up. All that is everywhere in the world. And to come back to what I said earlier in our presentation, it is true that some developing countries have extremely choked air pollution. But we in the global north, like in the Netherlands, Europe, we have eutrophication, dead zones caused by the overuse of fertilizers like nitrogen and phosphorus, which kills off the fish. It causes all kinds of problems in our river bodies as well as in the oceans. Plus, we dump a lot of our electronic waste on Africa, our plastic waste on Asia. We don't really deal with the problems ourselves, but essentially today, even all our soils are polluted with all these PFAS items. And now it is coming back into our system. We have plastics in our body, we have PFAS, and we don't know yet what the implication is, and we are giving an antibiotic treatment to everything that lives in the water. So that means that antibiotic treatment in the future in medical care may not work by 2050. It could become the #1 cause of death in 2050, when in operations, antibiotic treatment does not work. So the problem is that we have somehow created a development paradigm and development aspirations that are completely out of sync with the world in which we live. And that comes back to my narrative that we have to live within the boundaries. Now, the safe boundaries are boundaries beyond which the system begins to collapse. The biodiversity system collapses, or the climate system, or the water system, or it changes irreversibly. Those are the safe boundaries. A just boundary is a boundary that prevents harm to humans at a level. And what we find is that the just air pollution boundary is more stringent than the just climate change boundary, because probably air pollution is local and people are dying, so the WHO standards are stronger, and our 1-degree target is much weaker than the WHO standards for air pollution at the global level. So, because that allows around 1% of the global population perhaps to be affected currently, not in the future, currently. So basically what you're seeing is we need to have these boundaries. Where are we in relation to the boundaries? We are outside the boundaries. Every boundary has been crossed except the air pollution boundary globally, but the air pollution boundary has been crossed in cities of the world, as well as in villages where they do cooking on smoking chulas, smoking
wood and
yeah, exactly. So basically that's the biggest killer. 7 million people at least die annually from air pollution alone. So basically what you're talking about is a boundary of safe and just levels, as well as standards that prevent ambient air pollution, ambient water pollution, but also soil pollution. Okay? That's the boundary. We are outside the boundary. So basically the challenge for us is to get back into the boundary. Okay? But, so that's the first challenge. That in itself means shrinking our global pollution at least, which may have an impact on shrinking our global economy as we currently know it.
Yeah.
But having said that, around half the world's population, between 1/3 and half the world's population, does not even have minimum needs. So if you're outside this circle and you want to meet minimum needs, and we've calculated that for 4 things. We've calculated that for right to food, water, energy, and a house the size of a parking lot, and a little bit of transport, because you have to go and buy food. If you do that, you go way outside the boundary. And that basically means that the argument that developing countries make, so this is theoretical, huh? So arguments developing countries make that we have to meet the basic needs of people for energy and then we do it with fossil, should be changed. The narrative should be changed, and that should become, we are going to meet those basic needs but with a better system. Otherwise, we lock ourselves further and further and further into the spiraling narrative of fossil fuel use, and we get just locked in. We have to get out of that lock-in right now when we do all these new additional. And the reason why the North has to pay for that is because we have used for 25 years fossil fuel without care, even though we started the negotiations in 1990. We knew jolly well what the problem was. Okay, so now what we did was, if the situation is that you would go further out. How do we transform? So we in the Earth Commission, where I was co-chair, during the time I was co-chair, we discussed how do we get back in, okay? And one of the ways to get back in was to give everybody in the world 3 bulbs in a refrigerator or the equivalent energy, a house the size of a parking lot per capita. So if you have a family of 4 parking lots, okay. Some transport, some food, and you give everybody the same, and then you deduct that from the boundary and see how much is left.
Yeah.
And what is left is the corridor. And when we did the exercise for 2050, for climate change, there is no corridor, because if you give everybody 3 bulbs in a refrigerator, using pretty much the same system as today with some improvements, because as you can see, we are not really leaving fossil fuel behind right now.
Yeah.
So then there is no corridor, because then you're way beyond. And now people come back and tell me, oh, the global population problem is the big thing. I'm not putting my head in the sand. Global population is a challenge. Having said that, the top 4% has as much pressure on the global system as the bottom, as people below the minimum. So it is really a concentration of wealth and population, concentration of wealth and environmental footprint. And I think Oxfam came out with a report last year which said that within 1 hour of an Australian on his boat, private boat, emitting greenhouse gases is equivalent to an entire year's emissions of an average Australian. So it's really the top 1% with their private boats, their private airlines, that have an unbelievable impact on the world. Of course, many of us also have a huge impact, and so for us, it is really important that we try to get off fossil fuel in our private homes and think about the embodied fossil fuel in all the products that we are buying. And I think it will be possible to do that without losing a sense of well-being.
Yeah.
Having said that, the question over here is, how do we do this and why do we do this? And for that, we had to develop a justice theory. And the justice theory was based on a couple of ideas. The first idea is, what is the justice scholarship? And you find that there is a lot of justice work done by anthropologists and sociologists at the very local level about indigenous people and their values, local communities, old religions and their values. And then you have the global lawyers and the global thinkers like myself who think about global values and global value systems.
Right.
So there's a north to local to global, and on the other hand you have the conservative to transformative. A conservative justice system is like, let's take South Africa. I am a rich white farmer with a massive piece of land, and so if you want to take my land away and redistribute it to the local black farmers, I will ask you for compensation. And because you as the government can't pay me compensation, it doesn't happen. Yeah. And so basically what happens is, when rich people ask for compensation for the losses that they face, that they become richer and richer and richer. Right. And the poor people don't get anything because they didn't have anything in the first place. Right. So transformative justice tries to address that. It's on the right side. So our narrative is, we are doing an iterative process from local to global, but it is on the transformative side rather than the conservative side of justice. Right. The second point is that when you look, I was telling you earlier that if you talk to companies, they say, I do what the shareholder wants. And the shareholder is really primarily motivated by the financial aspects and a little by reputational damage. And most of them don't really worry about, we will be taken to court for problems or whatever. They don't think about litigation risk. They don't think about stranded asset risk. Many of those risks they keep out of the equation. So what happens is that they don't take the other into account. And the other is the person who is sitting on an island having a good life, who is made vulnerable by our behavior. They are not vulnerable by definition. So a lot of the literature says, oh, we are harming vulnerable people. No, we made them vulnerable. They were not vulnerable to start with. We made them marginalized by the way in which we divided and allocated resources. So the question of the fact that we are making people vulnerable is a very important message in this. And that is possible only when you do recognition justice. You're looking at the world from the perspective of the outsider. You might have heard in the last few days that the Pope has just died. Yeah. And a lot of the eulogies was about the fact that he was always talking about the outsider rather than the insider. So recognition justice is about looking at the outsider. Epistemic justice is not just about looking at how major macroeconomics theory looks at issues, but how do other societies do economics, and to learn from them. And then we have the three I's: intergenerational, intragenerational, and interspecies justice. So let's just talk for a little while for interspecies justice. We've left no land for nature. There's absolutely no land for the leopards, the tigers, the elephants. And they are shrinking so much. We go to Mumbai, the leopard visits the city at night because there's no place for the leopard. But you're also seeing that in other parts of the world where these wild animals are coming into cities at night. Bears are coming into cities. It's because we never left them land for themselves. And it's not that their population is growing, their population is shrinking like crazy because there is no food for them in the places where they live. And so as a consequence, what has happened is that there is very little room for nature, and nature is coming into the cities, and that is the cause of zoonotic disease. So 60% of all infectious disease today is caused by diseases moving from animals, birds, insects, to human beings. And those diseases could be avoided to some extent if we did not have this continuous interaction, close interaction with these other species. 1/4 of all disease and morbidity is caused by environmental issues. So air pollution in Delhi has a huge it has an impact on asthma, COPD, lung problems. It's almost like smoking cigarettes if you look at newspaper articles, so that's a hell of a problem over there. But even in the Netherlands, PFAS is in the water now, and that's very difficult to take out for our drinking water services. And I don't know if your telephone gives you the information, but my telephone is bombarding me with information on that. So it's everywhere in the world. And so the question over here is that 25% number will probably go up. So in fact, now what we're seeing is the planetary health movement developing, and they are building together with the planetary environmental movement to come together to talk about the fact that our health and our environment are intimately linked. And that is one of the reasons why we should work together on this. For me, health and human well-being are a cornerstone of justice. So intragenerational and intergenerational is all about your health, your happiness, your psychological well-being. The EU has said that if you can see 3 trees from your window, walk 300 meters to a park, and 30% canopy, then you will feel happy. And if you are in a place where there are no trees and no parks, it's going to have a psychological impact on you. And especially if you are very poor, which means your house is tiny, and especially if you are a senior citizen, which means you are not really going to work anymore. So for these categories, and children of course, these categories, the poorest, who don't have, and unfortunately, if you look at the records of where the green is always where the rich people live. The poorest people live in the neighborhoods with the least greening, whereas they need the green most for their mental happiness. Anyway, so there was a whole justice narrative that we developed, and we developed that in the face of all opposition, because everybody came back and told us injustices can be seen, and we all agree on what is injustice, but we don't agree on what is justice. And then I came back with, no, I disagree with you. I am not allowed to cause harm to another. And that is the fundamental principle underlying this entire justice story, that I'm not allowed to cause harm to the people sitting in Tuvalu and make them vulnerable. That's the recognition justice. I'm not allowed to cause harm to you based on your knowledge, not just my knowledge. I'm not allowed to cause harm to species. I'm not allowed to cause harm to other generations or other people within my own generation. So that's the principle. And then we then operationalized it into boundaries, the foundation that I mentioned earlier, and how do we get back in. So anyway, that's how the justice narrative has now been operationalized for the Earth system. So it is a systemic approach to justice that we have tried to articulate, and now we are working that out for water system justice and biodiversity system justice, and further developing the narrative. And climate justice.
Climate justice. Very clear. Thanks for that. That brings me to the question, why should we have hope then? What makes you hopeful? Or
my understanding is that things have to get sometimes really bad before things change. So when you find, if you look at the world situation in 1945, we got the UN Charter following World War II, unbelievable destruction, and then we get this narrative. We had a lot of slavery and colonialism, and then you get it reaches a peak point, and then you get the human rights. And initially, of course, human rights were not applied to slaves, but then because of the universalizing of human rights, it was applied to everybody worldwide. So you're seeing that you have to go really deep before you come out, and that's the first point. And I think we are very deep right now because climate is in emergency status, water is reaching emergency status, biodiversity, we are in the 6th extinction event. So, we are really, and we're outside all these boundaries. So we are really in an emergency situation. And so that's the first point. The second point is that it is very unpredictable when you get a solution. I remember Professor Kamal Hossain from Bangladesh, who was my examiner for my PhD thesis in the Netherlands. He once told me during the dinner of my PhD thesis, he said that I should not be pessimistic because when he was growing up, he never thought that the English would leave the country. And one morning they were gone. And that is how he experienced it. Maybe that one morning was over a year, but it's over a period of 400 years, or 1 year feels like one morning. But then I spoke to also a friend of mine who was in East Berlin the night before the wall came down, and he said he was really afraid to go out that night because they didn't expect the wall to come down. They thought they might get killed. So he was watching it on TV, and he was less than a kilometer behind the wall. And only when it came down and nobody was killing everybody that he dared to go out over there. And they did not expect it. The people in that area did not expect the wall to come down. I was watching when the wall came down in the news, and we never expected it the night before. So it happened like that. Things happen overnight, and you have to wait for the right conjunction of events to make the change. But the biggest challenge I face right now is misinformation and disinformation, not just me, but the world. Because what I find is that on the one hand, governments, my hypothesis is that people above the age of 25 never studied climate change, water, PFAS in school or college, right? I don't know, I was studied in school or college, I'm pretty sure you didn't. So what basically happens is if after that you're not educating yourself continuously through the right journals, the right newspapers, you know nothing about it. It's just a word. It has no meaning for you. And as a consequence, you're not going to support the entire policy-making process on these kinds of things. And if you become a politician, you don't care. Last week I was in Tallinn, and I was told that the younger politicians are much better aware about environmental issues than the older politicians. And the older politicians are less willing to take action. In Estonia, for example. So, to cut a long story short, I think education is really, really important, but what we are finding is that the big powers, the big multinationals, they are using misinformation and disinformation to give a different kind of information to the public. And this means that people are getting confused. So you go out and you talk to people and say, but oh no, climate change is not really happening, there's an ice age coming. Or the sun is going to stop having enough heat. I'm saying, do you know the time period during which that is going to happen? Do you know what that's causing? Do you know that climate change is already happening? It's not there in the future. It's already been happening since 1990. That there has been evidence since 1990, if not earlier. And people just don't know that. And that is that age group. And so what is basically happening is there's an intergenerational struggle between the children, the Fridays for Future, between Extinction Rebellion, which are the scientists, and the older generation that is so set in its ways and loves the power of the money that they have to buy and do whatever they like, the freedom of consumption without limits. And they love that so much, they don't want it. And somebody told me last week, again in Estonia, that the old generation says, oh, it's like going back to the old communist times when we could not do anything. And so that is like, no, we're not going there. And I think that whole current intergenerational battle has to be fought, and for that science and communication is so important. And for that I hope this film will also play a major role.
Amazing. Fantastic. In preparation to this interview, I spoke to a few friends from different places that I thought of in a few different age groups. And just like you said, I also realized that most people, even with master's degrees, some with bachelor's degrees, know very little about anything that you're talking about. and this is across developing countries, developed nations, all of this. And in that aspect, I see that ignorance is, at least from what I saw, it's everywhere. So how do we bring this academic?
The problem is, there's an article that was published last year which says about how the fossil fuel industry has penetrated universities. And that is a problem. But I think one of the biggest problems that we face in our universities is environment is just taught in the environmental class. The environment has to be integrated in development studies, into geography, into political science, into economics, everywhere. It cannot be an add-on or a specific topic. But to do that means you have to revise and you have to train also all the teachers. And those teachers are so specialized in particular areas that they will continue. And I think many faculties in the world still have a geography department that does fossil fuel training, training in fossil fuel use. And so the problem I find, especially because when I'm teaching, my students know all about it, but it is true when I'm confronted with another faculty and I'm talking to the people, they don't know anything about it. Whereas they don't know that if they have a pear, there's pesticide residues on the outside, that they should wash it with hot water and maybe with vinegar. They don't know those kinds of things. They don't know that they have to think twice on what they're eating, not just because of the environmental impact, but because the impacts to their own health. So it is unbelievably frightening how this is taking place. And also you find that the press is quite reluctant to cover many of these issues because they think it's bad news, it's risk work, and governments are getting very pissed off with people who talk about risks, whether it's environmental risk or health risk. They think, oh, you're just a bad news person, and you're talking about lose-lose, you're not talking about win-win. And so basically the whole narrative that you get thrown at you is it's your hobby, it's not really a big issue. And that despite the fact that we have enormous numbers of scholars working on these issues. Having said that, I am currently working on a global constitution.
A global constitution?
A global constitution. That's the money from the Spinoza, and you can spend it on any topic you like. And so I'm spending it on a global constitution. And the global constitution idea is based on the notion that we should rethink, how do we live with each other as countries, as people, as communities, as religions? How do we work together? How do we enjoy life? How do we produce? How do we invest? How do we consume? How do we distribute? Where do we waste? How do we waste? The entire narrative. So the storyline is as follows. We have an open science justice lab, which basically means that anybody above the age of 10 can write an essay or a painting or a photograph, not a sculpture because we can't do it with a sculpture, okay, but something we can do something with, about what they would like to see in the world they're growing up in. And it could also be that a grandmother writes an essay about the world she thinks should be there. So we have no limitations. It could be written in any language and it will be published, assuming that our computer system can take it in the language in which it is submitted with a small paragraph in English. And what we try to do is every 50 essays that come, they get very lightly edited. We don't clean the language or we don't do anything with it. We just make sure it fits into the page, and then we bind it and it's on our website. And every author then becomes a contributing author to the Constitution. And so far the people are sending in wonderful essays about, some of them even actually suggest paragraphs for inclusion in the Constitution. Sometimes young children write about the world they want to be in, mothers of twins write about what they want to see. So we are seeing all these ideas come in. So it's meant to be the Constitution of the inhabitants of the earth, which means that you could write, if you liked, as a hydrogen molecule. Somebody could write as a microbe, or you could write as an elephant. If you have a relationship with that, you are studying that, but you can also write as yourself. And all those ideas will then be used and researched by our 3 PhDs and myself. And then we will try to write a document. So it is going to be a bottom-up constitution. Right now, I think within the resources we have, we can go for 500 essays. But if I can do some fundraising which is effective, then I should be able to. My goal is to have 50,000 essays.
Oh wow!
But I have to do some fundraising for that in order to make it easier to manage. Also because we want this principle that language is not relevant I mean, you can write in any language, that's the idea. And also with artwork starts coming in, we have to figure it out. Anyway, to cut a long story short, so that's what we're doing. And then suddenly, and our website is globalconstitution.org with no space and all small letters. What we find is that all the other people working on similar topics are writing to us. And some of them are doing the UN Charter number 2, which is slightly different from a constitution, but very linked. So we won't redo what they do, but we'll try to link up with them and give them advice about what they are doing and hope that they will give us advice. And we have people who are working on the planetary commons, we have people working on how a new economics should look like. So we are going to make links with all these people and try to take all that info and see what happens. I am currently the co-chair of the 10-member group that advises the UN on science, technology and innovation. And we are independent of government, and we cover a lot of different disciplines. And I know that the UN is not yet ready for something like this. Having said that, maybe 5 years down the road, things change. Current rulers become older and may no longer be in power. Maybe the situation gets so drastic that people decide that they need something. And I'm waiting for that phone call which says, hey, what do I do? And I have a little story over here because years ago, I wrote a letter to the Dutch Minister of Development Cooperation on behalf of Dutch researchers in development cooperation that her COVID policies were not always very wise. And then she wrote me an email saying, can I speak to you? And I said yes, and I was preparing on each of the comments I had made. And then her opening sentence was, Professor Gupta, what do you want me to do? And I thought, shit, I have no idea what you should do. I know what you shouldn't do. And so this is why now I'm working on this global constitution. It's a what you should do, but I want to make it as perfect as possible, that political feasibility should not mean that things are taken out of it.
Yes.
You know, because otherwise if you already want to negotiate on it, then it's all...
Yeah.
So we want to have certain criteria based on which we are doing this, and that's the project, and it's a very exciting project, and I invite all your viewers to join in this project.
Please do that. I'll put in some links, and you can watch her videos as well. Also, more information on her, and please write to her as well. I want to do a quick, like a quick rapid fire kind of thing. It's going to be short, and then I'm going to ask you probably a last. So, I mean, if you want to answer in a word, that's okay. Or if it doesn't do justice, then you can probably use a sentence or something. Yeah. So, as an Indian in the Netherlands, what do you miss the most?
Food. Mishti.
Oh wow. Oh, Bengali. One thing you would take from the Netherlands and probably implement in India?
In the Netherlands, football is organized as a community thing, and parents are the trainers. Parents are the they sell the beer in the canteens, and it's a great leveler. Children, poor children, rich children, everybody can come together because it is very, very cheap. And I just loved the way it was organized, and I would hope to see if you could organize something like that in India, where parents don't just work for their own children, but also for the children of other people. And in their weekends, spend a few hours training kids on the football field. And then they don't have to be a football expert.
Right.
They can also just be the person selling the coffee and the tea or whatever, or they can be the person that is encouraging the children or making the uniforms or whatever, you know. So there are many roles, and I just think this is very important for children in India because they should be able to play.
Perfect, very nice. What drives you the most?
I am driven by an inner desire to make changes, and I hope, but it's mostly through science. And my big fear is that the earlier years of my life, I was sort of just publishing and in the rat race of publishing, and now I'm going out and just telling people what my research is saying, why it's important, and I'm really going into that educational field, because I think it's so important to communicate.
Perfect. Clear. What would be the most important action in sustainability?
So, of course, individuals need to take action themselves in terms of getting off fossil fuel and eating wisely, consuming wisely, reusing. But the most important thing is not doing something yourself, but trying to create groups and educating groups, going out to municipalities, going house to house, explaining to people why there's a problem, and trying to do that educational role which the state is not taking seriously. And so it's not just doing your own thing, but to multiply your effectiveness by educating a bigger group and trying to bring change into their lives.
Yeah, yeah. If I asked you for a book suggestion, or what is your favorite book, or could be taken in any way?
Gosh, that's a really difficult one. I'm sorry.
No.
When I was young, I was completely enamored by Alexander Dumas' books and the character of D'Artagnan about, honor and dignity, and the way the friendship between the four people, even though they were in different philosophical and political roles. That stayed with me all my life. And even last week in, where was I? I was in Maastricht and I went to see the statue of D'Artagnan. Very stupid, just a character from a book. But it is something that has stayed with me all my life, the need for good friendships. I have read recently some nice books, but difficult.
It's good for passive memories, I guess. Would there be a global leader that you look up to, or it could be in the past? Okay.
Many. I mean, I don't know about the global leaders, but I know my mentors, if you like. In my youth, there was a mentor in Ahmedabad. I was very respectful of some of his ideas and the ways he worked. Later on, life took him in different directions, but in those 3 years I found him inspirational. Professor Manubhai Shah. In the US I found Ralph Nader unbelievably inspirational. I also was his host at Harvard when he came, and I found him an unbelievably good speaker. But also Rob Hager, who was a lawyer fighting for many cases, including the Karen Silkwood case, was a very big influence in my thought processes when I was young. And then in the Netherlands, it was Pierre Wellinga who took me to a lot of, he was the person working on climate change, but also he was the person who gave me the room to think how I wanted, to mentor me in this entire process, and to help me become professor eventually. A very important person in my life. But in all of this, it has to be my parents and my husband, because my father was always giving me advice. He died when I was not so young, but still, he died a long time ago. My mother also has always been pushing, but it's also Hans, my husband, who reads every book I write, listens to me practicing every speech, and gives continuous advice. Yeah.
If not a climate scholar, what else? What would you be?
Constitution. A scholar of the Constitution.
Perfect, very clear. The worst myth about climate justice?
That the free riders of the global south, because they didn't take action between 1990 till 2020. That has been so beautifully portrayed in newspapers. China didn't do anything, or China is the big polluter, whereas historically China is not the biggest polluter. It may have become a bigger polluter since 2005 onwards, but a lot of it is also because of the narrative of the World Bank with its entire story of liberalization, etc. We put them on the wrong track with that whole story. And so I find that sometimes very, very disheartening that countries in the global south are often seen as sort of the competitive. As soon as they start to compete, they become sort of the enemy.
Yeah. Probably an advice to your students or students that you would want to repeat again and again that
I think for all students, I think it's really important that you engage, you enjoy, because if you don't enjoy your work and your research, you will hate everything. And for me, I found sometimes sitting behind a computer all the time working was not much fun. So I would really go out and do presentations and workshops and fields work, and then it starts to grow, and that means that you also learn all the time from the feedback you get, and it's also fun because you're going somewhere. So I think engagement and enjoyment are really, really important, and more importantly today is not just understanding what do these environmental, social and economic issues mean for you as a person, but trying to sell that to more people, because if you don't collect people around you and go out and talk to the public and try to change the way they think and the way they live, then we will fail in this task of creating the public movement necessary to support political, legal and economic change.
Very clear. Can the diaspora, the Indian diaspora, do towards India?
I have never studied the Indian diaspora, but my understanding of the Indian diaspora is that it is extremely diverse. We have people who are at the top of business, CEOs of top companies worldwide. We have people in politics in different parts of the world. They are also ministers or ambassadors. They are doing very, very well, or they're the wives of vice presidents. So we have people like that, and then we have the entire bunch of academics. We have a lot of people also, I think, in social movements who are also quite effective and strong. I think for the Indian diaspora, one of the most important tasks is to help India develop within the boundaries and the standards. If we can clean the air and the water and the soil in India, if we can ensure that the glaciers don't melt too fast and the groundwater system gets recharged, if we can do that, we don't need to invest in air purifiers, in water cleaners in every house. That's an entire industry that is really not needed if the municipality is able to do its job. And that also means that there has to be much more tax justice in India. And also those of us who are based in India, it's really important that the taxes are paid and that the taxes are properly spent. I think also for me, what worries me is not just inequality globally, but inequality within India. And I don't like inequality for a number of reasons. The first reason for not liking inequality is the super rich have unbelievable environmental impact on the world, plus of course they have a social impact. Everybody wants to be like them, and they can buy out governments should they wish to, because they are unbelievably rich. At the other end you have and that affects democracy, and at the other end the poorest have very little impact on the environment, but they are, as I said earlier, they are made marginal, they are made vulnerable because of saltwater intrusion or extreme weather events or whatever. And also because they are so poor, participation in democracy is much more difficult. And to access subsidies and to know what to do, etc., it's much more complicated. And so it's really important that in some ways we try to reduce inequality in India, in the Netherlands, but also worldwide. And I think that is, along with misinformation and disinformation, one of the biggest global challenges we face today.
Right, thank you. My last thing would be, it came up as a follow-up somehow, but what should probably, I'm going to take the example of India, but governments in the global south, what would be a message somehow?
It's very difficult for governments in the global south right now, because at the UN I am seeing, when I hear them talk, they're all very happy that they're going from low income to middle income to high income.
Yeah.
But nobody is talking about going from a high natural variability and good air to poorer natural variability to even poorer natural variability. And so what is happening is that these governments are caught into this World Bank classification of countries into LIC, MIC, HIC, and that makes it very difficult for them because they're all the time obsessing about that, and they don't want environmental and social issues to stop the development of those countries. Sure. And for me, and that is also partly because of the narrative that the rich world sells to them. And there's also a fear that the rich world, now that it's become so rich, is throwing away the ladder so nobody can climb up, and that also makes these countries very angry. But in the, politics is always extremely difficult in the developing world, and I am less informed about it, but my hope would be that people see the need for less pollution.
Yeah.
Whether it is water, soil, air, energy-related pollution, and that they really focus on enhancing the well-being of people. If health costs go down in India, productivity would go up. Health costs are linked to environmental costs. So maybe we have to look at the cost of inaction and see if we can convert that into a narrative that is so powerful and so strong that developing countries do not wish to invest when it is against their own economy. Developing countries also should not want to have stranded assets, that you start investing in new fossil that will lock you into debt as well as into employment issues for the next 100 years. So how can they make that leapfrogging move towards better renewable systems and more energy efficiency, so you need less demand in the total arena? I would hope sincerely that, India is the only country that has a tiger and a lion. Only country in the world that has those two animals. We do have quite a rich biodiversity, but in the 35 years that I've been going back to Noida, the eagle has died out. Or the vulture. Yeah, we had a very healthy population of vultures, and they have died because of all kinds of treatments, medicines that were given to animals and died. And that's a real pity. So in those 35 years, I've seen a lot of damage, and I think it would be wonderful if we could find a way to cherish all life on earth, and that is so much a part of the ancient Hindu philosophy. Living and let live.
Thank you. What a nice way to close.